Okay, so from boom to bust. So remember how we've been talking about how the Americans had gone out west. They were really trying to move out west. There was a lot of opportunities. There was the Homestead Act, creating plots of land for them, right? All those different things. So in the 1870s, a lot of farmers had moved out west. So there had been a lot of rain during this time. So because of that, the soil was very healthy. There was a healthy, mild climate, meaning not very hot summers, not very cold winters. There was pure water, very fertile soil, remember from all that rain, and very nutrient rich grass. So they took over the territory that had been for the Native Americans. Remember how we talked about how the Native Americans they really hunted buffalo out there. Remember the buffalo had been decimated, right? I mean, they had been, a lot of them were taken out, and the farmers really started to take over these areas where the buffalo had once been. And then we had these open range cattle drives. So basically, this was whenever we remember how we talked about how these cattlemen they drove their cattle right. Forced them to walk basically all the way to Missouri, right? All the way to the railroad lines. So the boom, whenever a whole bunch of people started moving out and starting these farms, lasted from the late 1870s into the early 1880s. And then we started the bust, meaning that there was a decline in profit, there was a decline in how many people were actually out there in the mid 1880s. So farming on the plains. So there were cheap railroad rates at this time. It really changed the game. Reason why? If you're not having to pay as much to transport your crops, right? You're able to transport a lot more. You're able to invest in being able to move a lot more product, right? So the transcontinental line, remember that was the one that connected the East Coast to the West Coast, was done by 1869. And there was also a creation of a lot of subsidiary lines. That means that there was a lot of other lines that went off of the transcontinental railroad itself. So the country was basically covered in railroad lines at this point. So, because of that, it made it a lot easier for these farmers to transport their crops. It also promoted a lot of settlers in land out west because they were able to have that connection to be able to move their product. There was also a need for fencing. Farmers needed to be able to enclose their land. They needed to be able to make sure that if they had crops that they were going to be protected, if they had livestock, the livestock was not going to wander off. So a lot of wood and stone fencing at this time was unavailable. So this is whenever we really started to see that practice of using barbed wire. Okay, that was how you see the type of the razor wire. You also see chain link type fences, right? That's that type of fencing that they used, and it promoted settlement in land out west because it was a lot cheaper to do. So why did this bust happen? So, one of the things that happened was there was scarce water. So, after all this rain had happened, they started seeing more desert like conditions again, meaning that there was not nearly as much rain. So, with that, when there had been rain, even if there was above average rainfall for that particular year, the ability to be able to access the actual water was limited, right? Because they had to depend on things like rivers and that sort of thing. And so after 1887, they saw a series of dry seasons, is what I was talking about with the water going, or sorry, the rainfall going down. It turned that previously fertile land into a semi-desert. So basically, that very nutrient-rich grass and everything had gone away. It was basically more of like a semi-desert type climate, meaning it was very dry. They had to drill very deep wells to pump out water. You might hear about people who live more out in the country, how they have to get well water. They actually have a well that goes down into the land and gets water from the groundwater. And this is what they used during this time also to be able to get water for their farming. They also did something known as dry land farming, which is basically the practice of once the dirt did have water on it, they would cover it with a layer of dust to try to keep it from evaporating. They also used drought resistant crops, meaning crops that were not as fragile if there had been a water scarcity, meaning that these crops did not depend as much on rainfall. And there was large scale small irrigation projects were very costly around this time period. So to do the farming that they needed to do, they had to depend on these dryland farming techniques, the wells, and that sort of thing. So, one thing that we'll talk about during the Great Depression was the dust storms. This was whenever there's a massive amount of dirt that went across the middle part of the country, really heavily in Oklahoma. We even saw some in Texas. And part of this happened because of this farming of the land. There wasn't anything to keep to keep the dust and the dirt from moving. There wasn't as many plants planted during this time period. And so because of that, that dirt and that sand just flew off and it created these huge dust storms. So the environment for that started here whenever these farms started to go into this bust period, meaning that there was not nearly as much plants being planted. So reverse migration. So basically, remember that there had been this huge migration of people into the West, right? Meaning that a whole bunch of people had moved into the West. But then, starting late 1880s, we saw a whole bunch of people moving back over to the East. So what happened? So basically, in the early 1880s, right, we saw the land value rose. So it was easier to get credit and loans. Basically, people were able to apply for credit and loans to be able to get farms in the early 1880s. Likewise, if they already owned their farmland, it was a lot easier for them to get their land refinanced, meaning that they could get extra credit based on their land rising in value, and they could use that as actual income for their families. But in the late 1880s, whenever we saw those desert-like conditions start to take over, it severely decreased the profits that these farmers were making, so that they were unable to pay on these refinanced on these mortgage loans. So because of that, some of them started to lose their farms. So we saw tens of thousands of farmers. They abandoned their farms. They moved back out east to work in the factories over in the industry. So this created that creation of ghost towns. If you've ever driven through some parts of Texas, you'll notice that there are some places that seem to have been abandoned. That is because of the inability to make an income, and these people basically they had taken the lives they built and they left because they no longer had the income to be able to stay in that one spot. So those who did stay, they saw the price per bushel, that means parcels of crops, that grouping of crops, severely decrease. It went from $1.60 per bushel in the 1860s down to $1.49, 49 cents per bushel in the 1890s. And so because of this, they saw their profits severely decrease and they were unable to get out of this debt from all of these loans that they had taken out. So we saw a shift from independent ownership to business ownership, known as commercial farming. So that only means that the farms, instead of being owned by individual families, they were owned by businesses. They used cash crops. So these are crops sold purely for profit, not used to make any possessions or any type of food. It was sold in the international markets and in the national markets, and it was bought in those markets by the merchants. Okay. They also, since these farmers were not making their own food, they were not making their own products, they depended on being able to buy products from these merchants. So, in other words, they were having to go to, how like we do today, how we go to the store, right, to go buy our groceries, we go to the mall, maybe, right, to go buy some clothes, that sort of thing. The farmers did the same thing. So basically they were earning money to be able to go buy their own stuff instead of using their crops as a method of making their own supplies and making their own food. So it made these farmers dependent on bank and interest rates, because they were really dependent on being able to pay back their loans, that railroad freight rate, because they were really dependent on being able to move their product to sell their product, and the national and European markets. So they needed a market to be able to sell their goods in. But one bad thing about this was they were also subject to that supply and demand, meaning that whenever there were a whole bunch of crops, the price per bushel went down. So that their profit went down. Okay, and if there were less crops, then they would make more of a profit, right? So they were dependent on that cycle of supply and demand to make sure that they were being able to sell their product. So they were not only at the mercy of the national level of supply and demand and that profit, but also they were subject to the international demand of supply and demand, that market. So instead of being more dependent on their local area for being able to make an income, all of a sudden they were dependent on the world to make an income, which is why these commercial farms really took over, because businesses are a lot better able to handle that type of environment versus an individual. So, worldwide overproduction. So, basically, from 1865 to 1900, we saw a whole bunch of countries participating in agriculture. Places like the US, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Russia. So basically the market became saturated, meaning that there was too much product. So what happens when you have too much product? The prices go down, right? So that there was a drop in prices for agricultural goods. And that meant that there was an economic dependence for more than 6 million farming families, meaning that these families were unable to really starting to they were unable to depend on themselves, so they were having to depend on federal services to be able to make it from month to month. And this is another reason why a lot of them left, and we saw them taking over by these commercial agriculture companies, because they were able to better uh, handle that type of environment. Another indicator that it was getting harder for the farmers to be able to um, make it on their own. You see that whenever the nation is not doing as well, a lot more people are renting, right? Because they're not able to pay for their own homes and that sort of thing. So whenever we see a growth like we did here from 1880 to 1910, you see this growth from 25% to 37% of farms being rented. That tells you that the economy is really starting to take a turn, meaning that it's not doing as well. Versus this mortgage land, it only went up by 6%. So you see here, there's a difference of 6% here in this mortgage land between 1890s and 1910, but there was a 12% increase in this rented land. So the farmers' grievances. So the farmers started becoming very frustrated about the market, and remember that they also didn't have as much of an education because they didn't have as much access to education in their area. So because of this, there was a lot of speculation. I mean, there was a lot of guessing in what was happening. Some of that guesswork was correct, but some of it not so much. So they had a lot of grievances against the railroads, meaning they were upset with the railroads because they charged more for the farm goods. This is where they were, right? The railroads were charging the farmers more to move their goods. That happened over in the South and in the West versus over in the Northeast, where they were making those industrial products. They were not charging them nearly as much. The railroads controlled the elevator and warehouse facilities. So why is this a big deal? Because the railroads were the ones who were controlling the mechanisms to be able to put things on the trains. Not only that, but they were also controlling any type of storage facility where the farmers would keep their products. So they bought the centers out, those warehouse facilities out, and they charged arbitrary rates, meaning they were very random rates. So they could say, hey, Joe, I'll let you use this storage facility for $200 a month. And they say, hey, John, I'm going to charge you, I don't know, $400 a month. Okay, so it was very random in how they were charging these people. So the farmers felt very jilted. They did not feel like they were being treated right. So there was a limited access to credit. So a lot of the credit was institutionally controlled, how it is today, right? Banks and credit unions, that sort of things, are the ones who really control the loans, right? This is whenever we really started to see that taking over. So the banks, the loan companies, the insurance corporations, they all controlled credit lines, meaning those loans that the farmers needed. Sources of credit in the U.S. also severely decreased. So basically what happened was they're trying to take out a loan maybe to make ends meet, right, until the profits go back up, until they were making more money, in other words. They were depending on these different banks, loan companies, what have you. But there was a lot less of these companies out in the West and out in the South. So they basically had to take whatever they could get. And these interest rates could be anywhere from 10 to 25%. That is a huge amount. Why do I say that? Let's say if we're starting with a loan of $1,000. That means that if there's an interest rate of 10%, then instead of owing $1,000, then that individual now owes $1,100, all the way up to 25%. That means that if an individual starts with a loan of $1,000, if the interest rate is 25%, then they all of a sudden have to pay back $1,250. Okay, so think of that as on a much larger scale. If you're buying $50,000 worth of land, right, that's going to be a huge, huge difference in how much you borrowed versus how much you have to pay back. So they were also trying to pay back these loans when their profits were very low. So they were not making enough money basically to make ends meet. Also, 1873, remember this is before the time of credit cards, right? Debit cards, that sort of thing. They used things like paper money, right? And the coins, okay? There was a lot less of that out in circulation. So because of that, there's also a lot less access to actual money. So belief in conspiracy. So basically, the farmers were conspiracy theorists at this point, meaning that they thought everything was going against them. So there was that variability of prices. Remember how we talked about how the farmers were not as educated, so they didn't understand really that role of supply and demand as much. So because of that, they did not understand why the prices changed. They could plant a crop when the profit was going to be high, but by the time they harvested the crops, remember it took a while for them to actually be able to grow these crops and harvest them, right? The price per the crop, price per bushel, what have you, severely decreased. So they would see a huge difference in what they were expecting to make versus what they actually made. They became convinced that bankers and local regional agents were fixing the prices, basically purposefully making it so that way they could not flourish as a farmer. They believed that manufacturers in the East were trying to keep agricultural prices down, industrial prices up. They were sort of right about this, right? Because we'll talk about things like big business and the trust and monopolies, how they were trying to control everything. So they were not wrong about this. We'll talk about this later in a little more detail. Different chapter. So they sold products in a competitive world market and they bought manufactured goods in a market where tariffs made international prices and domestic prices high. So basically what that's saying is they sold their goods in the world market. They didn't have to worry about things like tariffs usually in that world market. But whenever they bought their own goods, things like clothes, their own food, those sorts of things, they had to worry about tariffs if they bought it from other countries. Say if they wanted to buy a dress or that kind of thing from like France, it was going to cost a whole lot more buying it from France than getting that same dress from somewhere in the US because of tariffs. So that was on the international side. On the domestic side, meaning at home, the big businesses, those trusts we're going to be talking about, really controlled the prices. So they could make basically whatever they wanted to because there was no competition. So they could charge $250 for a dress if they wanted to, $250 for a loaf of bread if they wanted to, because they fixed the prices. So, reasons for discontent. So they were very isolated during this time. Remember, this is before social media, TV, cell phones, any of that, right? So you were just in a house, right? And had to depend on things to be able to keep yourself entertained. They were cut off from the outside world. Remember that these farms, when they first moved on to them, were 160 acres. That's huge, right? So being able to communicate with your neighbors, hang out with other friends, that sort of thing, was very limited. Winter meant loneliness and boredom. So, again, a lot of snow and ice. You're trapped in your house, right? No TV, no social media, no cell phones. Again, you had to be able to keep yourself entertained. They lacked education for their children because their schools would be very far out. They would not be as available, and those schools that were there taught multiple grades at one time. So it was a lot less efficient, a lot less effective in how these children learned. And then we had the rise of urban culture. Basically, instead of valuing being a cowboy, valuing going into the land of opportunity out west, it started to be more valued to be able to move into the city. So because of that, they also saw where on the social ladder, they went down a few rungs, meaning they were looked down upon by those who lived in the city. So last slide, the agrarian malaise. So Isolation and obsolescence. So what does that mean? Obsolescence means becoming outdated, basically meaning that agricultural lifestyle, being a farmer, became outdated. There was also malaise. What does malaise mean? Discomfort, illness, or uneasiness. Basically saying that they were very uneasy about um, being out west anymore. Uh, there was that image of the rugged cowboy, the western miner, which was still looked up upon a little bit more versus the image of the farmer who was thought to be uh, very looked down upon. They were a few very low on the social ladder compared to that cowboy. Remember, the cowboy was still below the city dweller, but the farmer, the agricultural worker, went even further below the cowboy. So Jason Edwards, 1891. So he was a writer. Hamlin Garland was a writer. He wrote this book, Jason Edwards. It was previous image of opportunity, wealth, and freedom. Remember that image of going out west, getting that land of opportunity, being able to have your own wealth, being able to be free from civilization, the rules of civilization. But those issues they were having with rural life, being very isolated, not having access to entertainment, that sort of thing was really starting to crush their spirit. So there's two lines from the story that really illustrate the plight they were going through, their struggle. So, a shanty on a barren plain, hot and lone as a desert, my God, meaning that a shanty, remember that's just basically a very small, very fragile house, right? On a barren plain, meaning there's not really anything out there. It's hot, you're lonely, and there's this my God, right? Meaning they're very discontent, they're very upset, right? And this is the reality of the dream, right? That dream versus the reality, what they thought it was going to be versus what they actually went through. So, last but not least, remember whenever these farmers had moved out west, they were basically really high on the social ladder. They were looked upon as heroes, as people who were taking that risk, and they were the backbone of American society. That means that American society really depended on them. But whenever we saw that rise of the urban class, basically that rise of the city class, the city dwellers really starting to take precedence over these farmers, then they really saw their position in society really go down, which means that they were very looked down upon. Okay, so that is the end of chapter 16. We'll talk about chapter 17 next week, and I hope you'll have and had a wonderful weekend. Goodbye, everybody.